Welcome everyone to our Fulbright Awards 2021 Affinity Groups webinar. My name is Sam Thompson. I'm the Program Manager for UK Scholar Awards here at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. And today is an opportunity for anyone interested in applying for awards to listen to representatives of our different Fulbright Affinity Groups come and talk a little bit about their experiences and answer any questions you might have about undertaking a Fulbright Award in the academic year 2022-2023, which is where our applications are open for right now at the moment. And you can go on our website if you want to find out any information about specific awards. Today's webinar is being recorded, so if you're not able to make a session that you think might be interesting or relevant to you, you'll be able to catch the recording of it at a later date. And we ask that if you have any questions, you can ask them throughout the session in the Q&A box, and we will get to them as we can. We also have closed captioning on today. So if you would like to have subtitles or captions for our conversation, you can turn those on at the bottom of the screen. You should have an option for it in your Zoom UI, and you'll be able to turn that on, and then you should be able to see and adjust the settings for any closed captionings that you require. As you ask questions today, they'll be read by either myself or my colleague Angelina, who is joining us as well. Angelina is the Program Manager for UK Postgraduate Awards, and we'll be able to read your questions, and then there will be time for questions, hopefully at the end of each session, to ask of our panelists. Thank you for bearing with me there, Tan, as I did a little bit of housekeeping. First off, we are joined by Tan Mai from Fulbright Lotus, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Lotus to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks for introducing me, Sam. My name's Tang. Fulbright Lotus is a platform organization that provides support and advocates on behalf of AAPI Fulbrighters within the Fulbright program. I started Lotus with Amika in 2019 after I finished my Fulbright program in Belgium, where I was at ETA. There, I kind of noticed that I didn't really have a big support system as a Asian person living in a tiny city in Hasselt. And so I decided that a way to remedy that was to sort of start this much wider organizations where other API members can meet up with each other and offer guidance and support.
Could I get you to give us the full, so use the initialization their API, which I don't think is commonly used in the UK. So just for our participants, could you maybe unpack that a little bit? So
Yeah, of course. So AAPI stand for Asian American Pacific Islander, and it was sort of used as a coalition term to encompass a wide array of different members of the Asian diaspora in America. API is kind of a controversial term, I think, in some Asian communities because some people don't view themselves as just Asian. They might think of themselves as, for example, I'm Vietnamese, so just Vietnamese. But as a sort of umbrella term, it really helps to mobilize other members, and it also sort of represent a very unique experience as a marginalized group in the U.S. in particular, having this sort of dual identity of being part Asian, but also like part American as well.
Great, thank you. So you set that up in 2019 as part of your, or just after you finished your Fulbright, you said, and could you tell us a little bit more about your Fulbright experience? So you were in Belgium and you were teaching English, is that right?
Yes, so I was in Belgium and I was teaching English right when Donald Trump was still president. So it was a very unique experience being American, living in a foreign country, having to sort of explain all these decisions that your administration makes on behalf of the administration. And during that time, I really felt very, I wouldn't say alienated, but I did feel very like I had to be the ambassador for my country in a lot of ways and have really uncomfortable conversations with a lot of people about certain policies that I myself didn't necessarily agree with, and I had to be very upfront about that. But I think what the Fulbright program sort of offers you the unique experience to do is, as much as I took on the task of explaining to so many people what was going on in the US and offering all these nuances, I realized that not everyone is actually willing to listen to these things. And so what I learned through my grant experience is just to have really important conversations with people, but with people who actually want to listen to what you have to say and actually want to get to know you and know your experience. And I think that was something that I had to really learn after having a lot of different just awkward conversations with people on the street, like who asked like I wouldn't say offensive questions, but just questions out of curiosity, like, do people bring guns to nightclubs in America? And having to be like, not that I'm aware of, it's not something really common, but it is something that people are curious about. And I felt like a lot of my experience was very centered on um, being the first Asian person people have ever met, for example, because in my town, I was the only Asian person there. And having to sort of explain that experience along with America as a whole was a lot. But I think having sort of more guidance towards having those difficult conversations could be really helpful for other marginalized groups who do end up being Fulbrighters and maybe even teachers like myself.
Mhm. And you to kind of stay on that last topic that you mentioned there, that experience of having to explain your experience as perhaps the first Asian and American person that someone's met. Do you think there are still areas of the US where an Asian British person would have a similar experience, where they were both perhaps the first Asian and first British person that someone in the States had met?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think that there are areas, maybe in less dense, less urban areas in
Mhm.
the United States, and more maybe farmish areas. Perhaps you went to one university in the middle of nowhere in the United States. That can definitely happen, and it could be the case that um, you know the people around you have no idea how to really conceptualize your identity, and it could be a really awful conversation
Mhm.
to have because you I guess the way I explain it is almost like the feeling of having to prove these things exist even though you live it to a complete stranger, right? But I also think the best way to sort of go about that is just meet a bunch of people that will become your people,
Mhm.
and in that way, even if a bunch of strangers might have, I wouldn't, maybe not heinous, definitely misguided conceptions of who you are, you always have this support group to sort of back you up. And I think that's really what's most important is just having someone there to offer you recognition as a person and
Mhm.
to sort of say that whoever you like, your identity is a valid identity to have, and it's your lived experience is a valid lived experience.
I think coming from a small country, as many of our audience do, and myself as well, it's really hard for us to conceptualize just how big and different the US is across the with 3 or 4 thousand miles or so that that it is, and obviously there will be lots of universities that are different within that. Do you think you could give us just a very quick, like 35,000 foot view on how someone's experience may differ in different geographic areas of the states? You mentioned there like some sort of difference between cities and rural areas, but does it become a little bit more nuanced than that and say like the South versus the Midwest or something?
Yeah, there are definitely, I don't, there are definitely different experiences in terms of norms and cultural experiences that you will have depending on where you are. I'm from the South, and so being from the South, people are very friendly. I like to give this anecdote of like you're on a streetcar and you just meet a stranger and they'll ask you about your life, and by the end of your streetcar ride, you've learned about this entire person's life, and you're just like, oh wow, it's really nice to meet you, Miss Mary. I hope everything goes really well with your grandson, and that's just a normal thing that happens in New Orleans, where I'm from.
Mhm.
But you would definitely not see that in like a city on the East Coast, say, for example, Manhattan. In New York, I recently was just walking down the street, and it's just very common for people to jaywalk, but not just normally jaywalk, like jaywalk to the extreme where there's like oncoming traffic and people are like navigating through oncoming traffic. So there's just a host of variety in terms of lifestyles, everyday interactions with one another, the way people form interpersonal relationships. Some places, like say the Midwest or parts of the South, people form a lot of their interpersonal relationships at church, for example.
Mhm.
If you're in the South, people ask you questions like, where do you go to high school? And that helps you determine what type of class you fall under, right? It determines your family background to an extent. And it's not something a lot of people know outside the South, or at least outside New Orleans, where I'm from. And then you get places like the West Coast where people, there's in parts of the area, there's a lot of wilderness and wildlife. And you just, I think, depending on the area, you get a host of different sort of philosophies on how to live life and politics and practices as well. And it's so hard to explain because it's all so very different from one another. I mean, there are some places that feel very like similar in a lot of ways, but other places where you're just like, I know we're technically in America, but it doesn't feel like we're America.
Right.
Sometimes within a state, for example, you leave the city and it feels like you're in a different part of the state, and you're not even like connected to each other. And so it's a really wild ride. But I will say this: if you want to visit other places and see like a bunch of different types of environments, the US is a perfect place to do that. Like if you wanted to be in an area where you could surf, but then also go to a city, you can definitely do that because it's just so huge. And there's just so many possibilities of places to go and people to meet.
Great. And when it comes to the universities themselves that are where our Fulbright will be hosted, do you think campuses in the US tend to be pretty welcoming, or do you think there could be some challenges adjusting to life on a US campus?
So I think in general, American campuses are their orientation is very comprehensive. They have like week-long orientations, and there's a million clubs, so there's always like some organization that you can join and be a part of. And so there's a lot of just from the amount of students in an area, sometimes there could be a lot of support networks, but that might not always be the case. There are times where you might be at a university, say a liberal arts university, which tends to be in the middle of nowhere. That's just the way things are. Sometimes, they have a founder who decided that I just want to build a college in Vermont, away from other colleges, and that's where you're situated. Um, but in those areas, I do think people are welcoming. It just might not be as you might not have as many like avenues towards other cultural things or avenues towards other support groups aside from the university. So everything would be so contingent on the university being a really great atmosphere. And while I think that's the case for most US universities, it might not be the case for all, which is why I think sort of reaching out to online groups is also really helpful as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess heading back to our initial question on our topic, I guess on sort of the support that Fulbright Lotus provides and students from Asian diaspora. We've got a question from the chat that I think you could provide some insight on, particularly, which is, so in the UK, when the term Asian is used in media or in casual conversation, people are normally referring to people from cultural backgrounds from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Is that something that, I guess, if you're coming from the UK, will you find that to be different in the US when people use the term Asian? And do people from those heritages face particular difficulties in the US?
I think there is, what I'm aware of is Asian really encompasses East Asian, and this has been something that's as brought up as a critique when it comes to the Asian community in America, because it doesn't always, I mean, from a pragmatic point, it does encompass people from India and Pakistan, but it doesn't always feel that way when people are trying to identify you on the streets. That's what I will say. I don't think culturally it feels that way, mostly because when you look at AAPI narratives, they're so centered on East Asians, and they so lean East Asian. I think that's really problematic. But that is one way to which things are very different in America, is the way that term is usually used. In the media, I think that it is used to encompass a lot wider range of Asian people, but I think in everyday life, when they imagine Asian person, I'm a Vietnamese person, but I think when they think of me, they just think I'm Chinese, and that is like the biggest stereotype that I face is I'm not even recognized as Vietnamese, they're like, well, I just think you're Chinese. So I think all Asian people are basically just Chinese. And that could happen. But yeah, it is a very, I think, changing. I think it's something that is changing though. But at the moment, I think when people say API, they in their heads they're imagining an East Asian person.
Mhm. Yeah, I imagine that could be quite the culture shock if you're coming from the UK, where you're used to talking about being from an Asian background, and then perhaps that not really communicating the same thing to an American person you're talking to could be quite difficult initially.
Yeah, but I do think people would then just focus on very like particularities, right? They'll be like, oh, you're a Pakistani British person. They'll just
Mhm.
focus on that,
Mhm.
but they won't include you in this larger group. And that will be really awful. But also, they'll recognize you. They just won't recognize you as this other thing. But that's because of America's long, messed up
Yeah.
history. Yeah.
Our audience member that asked that question asked, are there any particular challenges that someone from that background would face in the US? Do you have any insight on that, or do you have, or is that just a little bit out of scope for our discussions?
Um, I I think that anyone that's usually a minority is gonna have some problems in the US, unfortunately. And I think the darker your skin is, the more problems you are gonna accidentally, like not accidentally, but you will just face on an everyday level. And it won't be, I will say it's not, um, for some of my friends and for me in particular, it's not issues that are more like avert racism. It's more, I think people work a lot on cognitive biases and they sort of navigate their lives using a lot of shortcuts to make assumptions about people. And so it's a lot of microaggressions that you kind of face. And those are really hard to navigate because they're not direct violence against you, but they are in a lot of ways still very dehumanizing.
Yeah.
And that's something I think is happening a lot. There is, of course, for right now, for any marginalized group, there is a fear of like some physical violence, but I think the biggest thing that I encounter is just people just saying really weird things, like Asian women are very quiet, things like that. It's just stereotypes that people would just casually put into a conversation and just let it slip, and they're just like, not say anything about it, and then you have to react to it because of course that's not an okay thing to say.
But I guess, as you were saying earlier, on campuses and online, you'll be able to find different support networks to make that time that you spend in the US a little bit easier. But still, I think it's good to be aware of some of the challenges going in the first place. Focusing, I guess, a little bit more on what Lotus does as well. Do you have some examples of some of the support or activities that you've organized over the last, I guess, 2 years since being set up? I know that we've been in a difficult situation to organize big events in person, but perhaps some of what the membership and yourself as a committee get involved in.
Yeah, so Lotus, because we form our organization mostly online, has always been hosting online, or well, at least meeting up online even before the pandemic. So we were already online pre-pandemic, and a lot of the events we've hosted have been we have a monthly book club where people get to read different sort of stories, and then we sort of talk about those complexities with each other and our experience living abroad. And then we have a Slack network where people kind of introduce themselves and offer resources. And we also have panels that we host every few, or at least that we get together with people to partnership with, where we talk about like very key issues that we think are important to like Asian Fulbrighters in general, not just API Fulbrighters, like reinstating the Fulbright China program, or having a meeting to talk about having a professor come in and talk about fighting racism through film for Asian members. Just sort of helpful resource guides that we think are important. We also have a mentorship program where we basically pair a mentee with a past alum so that they have someone to talk to, and we work really hard to pair them based on their sort of individual preferences. If you say, for example, if you want someone who is from your background or someone who lived in the country that you're going to, we work really hard to pair those two people together, and then throughout the course of, I think, 6 months, we evaluate on whether or not that mentorship program worked. We just recently launched it, so we don't really have the data behind that yet, but it is something that we push for really hard this year, just because we know that it can be really challenging to move to another country and start your life over.
I think it's, but I know you said that you've not had the feedback on it yet, but it's really exciting that it's happening this year for our incoming class of Fulbrighters, that they'll be the people who get to benefit from that right away. So that's
Yeah,
really cool.
we're really excited about it. We've been trying to push for this for a long time, and so we recently just launched it. And Mika, who's my other co-founder, she does the entire project behind it. But a lot of what we're hoping to do right now is just to have sort of smaller gets-together, like a happy hour or a book club here and there, just because we know that people are sort of tired of watching long panels on Zoom.
We
So,
say doing a long panel.
but we try to limit it. I will
Sure.
say, I do try to limit it. So a lot of our events are less formatted and a lot more casual, just so that you can, maybe you want to rant about your experience. You don't necessarily want to be in a very formal setting. We try to set up events where you can do that.
Yeah, great. That's really cool, and I'm sure something that people will be really excited to engage with, should they be successful in their applications. We've got a question on something we've touched on a little bit, but I think it's perhaps good just to reiterate and provide some confirmation. So, do most big cities and universities in the US have a Fulbright community or just regular community for minority students? So whether it's Fulbright or university-led, is that something accessible to most students?
Oh yeah, of course. I think every university will have they will have so many clubs, but I think every university will have a club just for like there's definitely going to be a large international community, a lot of big universities, or even if you're in a big city, you'll find people because, for example, if you're in Boston, there's like tons of colleges in Boston. So you're just going to find community there just because there's so many international students going to school in Boston. But if you decided that what you really sort of relate to the most is being a Fulbrighter, which I'm gonna say might not be what you're looking for. You are. There's a at most major not universities, cities in America, there are Fulbright associations, and so they're like associations that are formed by past Fulbright alums, and so they can maybe offer another space for support as well. But I really would just go to the like I think during your orientation as an international student, they're going to give you a list, like a bunch of events just for international students. I say go to those because I think when I was living abroad, the group of people I relate to most were the people who are all living abroad as well. Just because we all face the same problems. But there are also, all tiny little clubs that are more geared towards maybe your specific identity. For example, my sister went to Stanford and she was part of the Vietnamese Student Association. And so they do exist and they are there to support you.
Yeah, I guess, as you say, it will depend on the size of university for how specific perhaps the organization can be, but at least having access to an international students group is going to be presumably a huge benefit for dealing with that early culture shock and such.
Yeah, and it's also a really good place because maybe you run into things that are very uniquely American and you want to complain about it, and they can support you on that, and it's okay. And so I really benefited from my international group that I was a part of when I was living abroad.
Thank you. So is there anything you wish that someone had told you before you went on your Fulbright experience, or perhaps even before applying, that you wish you'd known that you know now?
Yeah. Before I applied, I thought that So I had been to Belgium before. I tried to be a Fulbrighter in Belgium, and I thought I don't know, I was very confident that it was going to be a great experience and everything's going to be very smooth sailing because I already been to the country and I was like, I can't foresee any problems coming up. And then when I got there, things were quite different. And I will say something I wish I knew was um, I was so focused when I because I was an English teacher, I was so focused on being ambassador to the US and really like, proving that just explaining things in a way to which as clearly as possible. And I thought that every moment, every conversation I had with someone was a teachable moment where I could really, just advocate on behalf of like certain American groups that like things are different. And I just wanted to offer all these nuances to my situation. And I realized early on that not everyone cared. I
Mm.
mean, they might ask me a question, but they didn't really, they already sort of made up their mind about what America was like. So they really didn't care what I had to say. And I kept trying to talk to people who I guess were acting in bad faith in regard to my experience. And something that I think a lot of other AAPI Fulbrighters who travel abroad, but other just people who travel abroad in general from a country where people have a lot of preconceived notions of that country, you kind of feel like you're talking to a brick wall sometimes because you're sitting there like, I can offer these really like lived experience. This is what is actually happening. Um, but you know, not everyone wants to listen to you, and that's okay. You don't have to, explain everything to everyone. Not everything is a teachable moment, and sometimes you can just let it go and just walk away, and that's fine. Like you're supposed to represent the US or represent your country, and the best way to do that, I think, is just to be yourself and just be honest about what you believe. And as respectful as possible, of course, but just being staying true to you who you are, I think, will help you to sort of form better relationships with people and come off as a lot more genuine than just trying to like explain yourself to every stranger that you meet, because you're just not going to convince everyone, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear. So as we draw to the end of the session, where can people find Fulbright Lotus online? What platforms are people able to find you on, and what should they search for, I guess, to find those things?
Yeah, so we're on Instagram at Fulbright Lotus, and we're also on Facebook. I think we get most of our traffic from our Instagram page, but you can also reach us on email. We also are just FulbrightLotus@gmail.com. So we made it very easy. Just put in Fulbright Lotus, and it'll just pop up on all the platforms that we're on. Um, we're very, I think we answer our emails and our Facebook messages within the hour, so we're very fast responding. Because everyone in my organization, just a little tidbit, we're all living in different time zones, so no matter where we are, one of us will answer the email. So it seems like we're a very responsive group, just based on the fact that none of us are sleeping essentially. So it just seems like we're there 24/7.
Great. Well, I imagine that's very it's a real reassurance to people reaching out to you that they always know they can get an answer, regardless of when they're asking the question. So that's really great. So I'm just going to find out if we've got any more questions, but we are very, very close to the end of our time. So I think as we hit past, I'm gonna start us moving into our next session. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tan. Thank you. It's been really great hearing from you, and it's been really really interesting hearing your experience, and I hope helpful for people joining us from home. So thank you for your time, and thank you for setting up Fulbright Lotus for people all around the world to make use of your support.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I wish everyone the best of luck during their application season.
Great. Well, have a great rest of the day.
You too. Bye.